Hi, and welcome to Generous Theology. Today, Chuck and Brock are reflecting on how common grace manifests in the exceptionalism of non-believers. They discuss examples from literature with authors Frank Herbert and Isaac Asimov.
All right. So, Chuck, welcome. I'm so glad to talk with you tonight. And I think one of the things that I wanted to bring up, it's an impromptu topic, but you have a little bit of preparation because you and I have discussed this on occasion before. And that is the idea that one can see great Christian themes, even in cultural works by non-Christians, even in unexpected places. Sometimes what you and I might say is the image of God, the remnants, might come out, and something really beautiful and insightful about the human condition as God created it and maybe intended it to be can come out. And so I just wanted to open that up. I had two particular examples in mind to share. And Chuck, of course, feel free as you have some ideas on your end. The first one I wanted to bring up is recently Isaac Asimov's Foundation series has been turned into a drama. I think they're trying to span it out over 8 seasons, and they've broadcast 5 or 6 episodes in season 1 already at this point that we're recording. That's pretty exciting. And of course, Isaac Asimov was a secular humanist, and I believe one of a very notable one. And so to see some Christian themes, or maybe let's say some themes that weren't unique to secular humanists, come out in Asimov's work was really something striking to me. And the second item there to go through as well is today we have the release of a new movie called Dune, based on the Frank Herbert novel. And again, Herbert is no Christian, but he writes with such insight and such resourcefulness about the human condition that it feels like the world he has created is very plausible and very real, even though it's a fictitious work. And so I would even put Asimov and Herbert in the creative class or category of even sort of Christian writers like C.S. Lewis or J.R. Tolkien, who also created worlds and populated them and discussed dramatic events that happened in those worlds and how they related. And so that's just to open things up. Chuck, how does that strike you? And what do you feel in general about the idea of seeing the remnants of God's creation, even in the works, especially the artistic work of people who aren't Christians but are non-believers?
Yeah, I think I tend to be a strong believer in this idea of general revelation, that God reveals himself in ways both in Scripture, the special revelation, but in other ways as well. And often the way he does that is through human beings. And the image of God makes itself known through humans and through their works, often when they don't even realize it. And that's, I think there is something to be said for that. So obviously somebody like Isaac Asimov, I think if somebody did a real deep dive into Asimov, there would be so much there that we could look at. And people might say it's a reflection of the fact that he comes from background, even though he himself was not practicing as a Jew. And that may well be true. Frank Herbert, I don't know anything about Frank Herbert's background, but there are plenty of others. I think we even see this in totally non-Christian folks who don't understand what it is that they're reflecting. Perhaps they just think they're reflecting the world around them. But because we know that there's not square inch that Christ claimed, that's mine, if they're reflecting something going on in the world and they're picking up on some aspect of what they're seeing in the world, they are in many ways reflecting God. Imperfectly, certainly, but they are. And I know my kids, when they were in junior high, they had a teacher who would, on occasions, I think usually it was on Fridays, maybe on Fridays or before holidays and things like that, he would often encourage them. He would say, yeah, we're not going to have a regular lesson today in this class, but in Bible class, what I want you to do is I want you to bring me whatever it is, the music that you're listening to or books that you're reading or ideas that you have, and we're going to talk about them from a perspective. Now, sometimes it was more kids would bring stuff in and it would be more to say, hey, it's bad. Christians shouldn't be listening to this music, or it presents ideas that are negative. But oftentimes he would also point out how there is something to be learned. And it was often because kids at that age are very interested in just getting interested in popular music. A lot of times it would be in musical works. And often at that age, a lot of pop music is about relationships. And so a lot of times he was pointing out how even though there is a lot of negativity in the world in the way that we deal with relationships, there are still things that you can learn about how God has designed us, even in some of this music. And I know that that had an impact on my kid, and it was a real positive thing to do. And I think we can do that. I have to be careful. We don't want to say that everything reflects God's glory so well that anything is acceptable and anything is doable. Obviously, that's not true. We have to have discernment, but training for that kind of discernment using art and literature and taking time, whether it's with kids or whether it's really as adults in our churches and things, to analyze what are we finding in this piece of literature? What are we finding in this piece of art? What are we finding in this music? What are we finding in this television show? What might we learn about God and his creation in it? And that it's really, I find that, I think that's a useful exercise that Christians probably should do more often, and especially more often in groups where we're working together and looking at things maybe from different perspectives, but also we're there to encourage each other if maybe we're getting a little off track or whatever. It's a great thing. Yeah.
Let me just take sort of one side detour into, let's start with foundation. So this is Asimov's work. It first appeared in a serial form in scientific magazines back in the golden age of science fiction, I believe in the 40s and 50s. And eventually these serial small short story adventures were bundled up into a package. And that package was published as a 3-volume series, I believe in the 1950s. So Foundation, and Empire, and then Second Foundation were the first 3 works in this trilogy at the time. Now, it later expanded to include novels with after those 3, and then it also expanded to include prequels. But those first 3 were the beginning, and that's where we're starting with the television drama here in 2021. And I think 2 of the major ideas that I am absolutely astounded by with Asimov. The first is his intuitive way in which he presents a plausible, compatibilistic universe. Now, this could get deep and in the weeds, and hopefully not too dry. But compatibilism is the philosophical idea that determinism and human free will or human moral agency are ultimately reconcilable. They're ultimately not at odds with each other. And so sometimes you hear people phrase the question, if God determines the future, how could I possibly have free will? How could I be doing the things that I want to be doing? Am I not just a robot in such a scheme? And I would say that's a naive philosophical approach. And historic Calvinism has been what we today call compatibilist. The word itself has maybe only had usage in the last 100 to 150 years or so. But there is this idea in Reformed theology that God compatibly works his sovereignty with human agents, and that what happens in reality is a product of both. So, Chuck, you might be there on the other side of this connection, and you're eating an apple. Yes, you're eating that apple of your own free will, you would say, but at the same point in time, past events in the universe, along with God's determinative plan, has put things together in such a way that you've arrived at this spot and you've made the choice that you've made. And so we have to ask, are these really incompatible ideas, divine sovereignty and moral agency? And so with Isaac Asimov, we have a literary example of a universe that is plausibly compatibilistic. And I'll explain how. So the main character in the early part of the first Foundation trilogy is a scientist, a mathematician, a psychohistorian, Asimov will call him, by the name of Hari Seldon. And Seldon develops these mathematics. And what he does is he models the behaviors and interactions of human societies as if he were modeling the behavior of large statistical samples of gases. And where if you look at any individual molecule or atom of gas under observation, it would be very difficult to tell or predict how that atom will interact in its neighborhood in the immediate future. You can still use laws, the laws of chemistry, Hooke's law, I believe it is, about gas and the pressures relating to temperature and energy and other factors there. You can use it to speak quantitatively about the gas as a whole. And so Selden uses this to predict that the galactic empire that he is a citizen of, this galactic empire that has lasted for millennia, unbeknownst to everyone, is actually in an extreme state is going to. And so his mathematics shows that while he cannot stop the fall, he can nevertheless shorten the period of barbarism, shorten the period of destruction and carnage and suffering, so as to bring about another galactic empire, one that is stronger and more vibrant, in just a short 1,000-year period of chaos and difficulty and struggle. And so at first, Selden is simply measuring reality and making predictions from it. But as the series moves on, it's more and more clear that the mathematicians he has trained are not only measuring the state of the human model, but they are perturbing it, making changes to move toward the outcomes that they want. In other words, they're working with the free moral choices of the people in the universe to determine what will eventually come. Now, that in and of itself is a far cry from the Calvinistic understanding of the scriptures and God's determinative control and sovereign control over reality. But yet it's an intuitive example and look into it that actually helped me when I first read these novels as a teenager. It helped me understand the free will versus sovereign grace debate. I never saw them as enemies, and I still find it difficult to completely relate to people who only think incompatibly here. So from your perspective, how do those concepts play out with your life and how you've been able to interact with things and see people, maybe interact with works of art? I know you haven't maybe particularly read Asimov himself, but maybe you've seen something else that's given you that intuitive understanding or view into something.